I gave my son everything I had, but when he looked me in the eye and handed me a gift that carried poison instead of love, I realized the bond between us had already been broken long before that moment. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. The desert mornings in Scottsdale always carried a certain stillness. At 67, I had grown to appreciate that quiet, the way the sun crept slowly across the red clay roof tiles, how the air smelled faintly of dust before the heat rolled in, and the silence of a house that once echoed with my wife Margaret's laughter. It had been 5 years since she passed, and although I had learned how to fill my days with routines, nothing replaced the sound of her voice or the warmth of her presence. Birthdays, especially, felt hollow without her. I woke early that morning, as I always did. Old habits from my years as an engineer, and before that, a brief stint in the Army, never faded. The discipline of routine kept me steady. I brewed a pot of black coffee, folded the local paper across the kitchen table, and sat in the leather chair by the window where I could catch the first streaks of sunlight. The house was tidy, as usual. I had no one to make a mess of it but myself. Margaret had given me a watch on our 25th anniversary, a simple silver Seiko. Nothing fancy, but it had been her way of telling me that time, though relentless, could be shared meaningfully. I wore that watch more often now, running my thumb across the scratches on its face, as if the marks themselves were her fingerprints. To me, watches were never just about telling time. They were about order, trust, and the way a man lived his life. My son Andrew had never cared much for those things. He was 38 now, a man with sharp suits, fast cars, and an appetite for the kind of success you can flash in front of people. We were close once, back when Sunday dinners were regular, and Margaret made roast chicken with mashed potatoes, Andrew's favorite. But since marrying into the Lawson family, he had become more distant, more polished, more dismissive of the values I tried to instill in him. Richard Lawson, his father-in-law, was a big name in real estate. To Andrew, Richard represented the future. I, apparently, was a relic of the past. Still, fathers hold on to hope, even when they shouldn't. Each year I half expected Andrew to call, to show up on the doorstep, or to remember what mattered beyond his next business deal. More often than not, those expectations left me staring at an empty phone screen. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was stirring. Across the street, I saw Mrs. Jensen watering her petunias, and young Mark Thompson fiddling with his lawnmower, clearly out of his depth. Sometimes folks came to me when things broke down. Garbage disposals, squeaky doors, a leaky faucet. I didn't mind. Fixing things gave me purpose. My buddy Tom Henderson, a retired firefighter, often stopped by with a six-pack or just to sit in the shade and talk about the old days. But on birthdays, I felt the absence of family more sharply than any other day of the year. Around 11, the doorbell rang. The sound startled me, since deliveries rarely came before noon. When I opened the door, there was no one standing there, just a neat brown package resting on the mat. It was wrapped too perfectly, like it came straight from a department store. I bent down, picked it up, and noticed the label, typed, not handwritten. 2 words, "Happy birthday." No note card, no dad, no warmth. Just words a stranger could have typed in 5 seconds. I set the package on the kitchen table, staring at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to leave it unopened. The other part, the part that still remembered the boy who once tugged at my sleeve asking for help with his math homework, wanted to believe it was a gesture that meant something. My fingers worked at the tape until the box gave way. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was a watch, a Rolex, the kind you only see in glossy magazine ads. The polished gold caught the sunlight, throwing sharp glints across the table. For a moment, I just sat there, silent. Andrew knew I valued watches, but this felt strange, extravagant, impersonal, and, if I was honest, unsettling. Why now? Why this? He hadn't called, hadn't written, but here was a gift worth more than most people's yearly salary. It didn't feel like reconciliation. It felt like something else. I held the Rolex in my hand, its weight heavy and foreign compared to Margaret's modest Seiko on my wrist. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or insulted. Time had always been about meaning, and this felt more like a transaction than a gift. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, and the air seemed to thicken around me. Birthdays used to be about laughter, family, and the promise of another year together. Now it was me, a silent house, and a watch that didn't feel like it belonged. I couldn't shake the thought that this gift was less about remembering me and more about making a statement. As I closed the box and pushed it away, I felt the same emptiness I had started the day with, only heavier. I didn't know it yet, but that watch was about to pull me into a web of betrayal and danger that would change everything I thought I knew about my son, and about myself. If you're still watching and this story has you feeling that sting of betrayal, drop a number 1 in the comments so I know you're right here with me. The late afternoon sun in Scottsdale had a way of softening the desert edges, turning the red earth and cacti into something almost gentle. Inside my house, however, the air felt weighted, and I couldn't tell if it was from the dry heat or the strange unease in my chest. I set the package on the dining table and peeled back the wrapping, careful the way an engineer handles a delicate part. Nestled inside a velvet box sat the gleam of a brand new Rolex. The watch was heavy when I lifted it, heavier than it looked. Its steel bracelet links caught the fading sunlight, scattering it into tiny, sharp reflections across the table. The face was pale silver, with luminous hands that ticked in precise, arrogant confidence. A crown logo at the top marked its pedigree, the kind of emblem men wore when they wanted to be seen. My fingertips traced the edges of the bezel, smooth, flawless, no scratches, no marks, fresh from a showroom. It should have felt like a triumph. After all, what father doesn't want a gift like this from his son? But my heart tightened instead of swelling. I thought back to Margaret. On my 50th birthday, she'd saved for months just to buy me a simple Seiko. Nothing flashy, nothing grand. But that watch had lived through every project in my garage, every Sunday service, every quiet dinner with her by my side. It wasn't about the cost, it was about the thought. She'd picked it because she knew I cared for things that worked, that lasted. This Rolex, by contrast, felt like a billboard. A signal of wealth, not of care. I placed the Seiko beside the Rolex on the table, the contrast almost cruel. One bore the faint scratches of a life shared, the other the cold perfection of a life performed. For a moment, I imagined Andrew sitting with his wife's family, planning this purchase. Was it his idea, or was it Richard Lawson's hand guiding him? Richard had always been the kind of man who judged worth by brand names and net worths. I sat back in my chair, staring at the Rolex, and tried to will some joy into myself. Maybe this was Andrew's way of reaching out. Maybe this was his awkward attempt at a bridge, but no matter how I twisted it, the gesture didn't feel like his. Andrew had never been one for thoughtful gifts, let alone extravagant ones. He was more likely to call me last minute, asking for help with his mortgage payment, than to send something that cost more than my entire tool collection. The unease deepened when I noticed the paperwork tucked under the velvet box. A warranty card should have had the buyer's information, the dealer's stamp, the date of purchase. But this one was blank, its lines pristine and empty. No dealer, no signature, no proof. It was like the watch had appeared out of thin air, anonymous and untraceable. I held the card between my fingers, feeling its stiffness. My stomach dropped a little further. I reached for the phone, deciding I'd call Andrew. I didn't want to sound ungrateful, but I needed to hear his voice, to ask him why. The line rang twice, then went straight to voicemail. I tried again later, and again the call failed. Busy, disconnected, or maybe ignored. The silence on the other end wasn't just technical, it felt deliberate. The evening shadows grew long across the living room walls, and I found myself pacing. I thought about Richard Lawson again, about the way he once looked at me across a dinner table as if I were the inconvenient past his daughter's husband couldn't quite shake. He was a man who never came empty-handed, but always expected something in return. A Rolex smelled more like Richard's style than Andrew's. Could it be that Andrew hadn't bought this at all? Could it be Richard pulling strings, sending a message I hadn't yet deciphered? The thought lodged itself deep. I imagined Andrew standing silent while his father-in-law arranged everything. The typed happy birthday on the package label came back to me. No handwriting, no signature, just those sterile words. I placed the Rolex back in its box and slid it away from me on the table. The Seiko remained in front of me, its face worn but still ticking faithfully, as though reminding me of what mattered. I didn't want the Rolex in my house tonight. It didn't belong here, not among the photos of Margaret, not beside the tools in my garage, not in the life I'd built with my own hands. I turned off the lights one by one, leaving the watch in the dining room, as if it could sit there alone until I decided what to do with it. But as I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this gift wasn't a gesture of love. It was a move in a game I hadn't agreed to play. And somewhere, deep in the quiet, I knew my peaceful days in this house were already numbered. If you're still watching and sensing how heavy the silence can become in a family, type number 2 below so I know you haven't looked away. The morning after my birthday, I woke with that Rolex still on my mind. I had pushed the box across Richard Lawson's table and left his house the night before with a pit in my stomach. Something about the way he slid the watch onto his wrist, almost triumphant, had left me uneasy. I told myself it was just jealousy, that maybe I still wanted to hold on to pieces of my past, even if I had no use for them. But deep down, I knew the feeling was something heavier, something I couldn't quite name. By late morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking lukewarm coffee and staring out the window at the saguaros swaying in the desert wind. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Andrew. His voice was tighter than I'd heard it in years. "Dad, tell me you still have the Rolex. Kiss." I frowned, setting the mug down. "No, I gave it to Richard. Figured he'd get more use out of it than I would." There was a pause so sharp it cut through the line. I could almost hear him grinding his teeth. "You gave it to Richard?" "Yes," I said slowly. "Why? Wasn't that the point of the gift?" A long breath came through the receiver, then nothing. The line went dead. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the wall clock as if it could explain the silence. Andrew hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't even tried to cover his reaction. It wasn't the kind of silence a man has when he's disappointed. It was the silence of someone caught off guard, someone who'd just had his plan thrown off course. My chest tightened. I wanted to call him back, demand an explanation, but before I could decide, the phone rang again. This time the number was unfamiliar. I answered cautiously. "Mr. Miller?" a woman's voice asked, trembling. "This is Ellen. Ellen Lawson." My grip on the phone steadied. "Ellen, what's wrong?" "It's Richard," she said quickly, her words tumbling out like stones rolling downhill. "He collapsed this morning. He's in the hospital. The doctors think it might be poison." I felt my body go cold. "Poison?" I repeated, not quite believing it. "They found some kind of residue on his skin. Around his wrist. The doctors think it might have come from the watch. The Rolex he wore last night." Her voice broke. "He said you gave it to him." My eyes flicked to the empty spot on the counter where the velvet box had sat. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Is he?" "They're working on him," Ellen said. "I just thought you should know." She hung up before I could find the right words. I lowered the phone slowly, my hand trembling. The kitchen suddenly felt foreign, like I was standing in someone else's home. Poison, the Rolex, Andrew's gift, my own birthday present, passed along because I thought it would mean nothing more than a token of luxury. But it had nearly taken Richard's life. I pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. My heart thudded against my ribs, not from my condition, but from a wave of realization that left me dizzy. Had my own son meant that watch for me? Was this gift not meant to honor me, but to end me? I leaned forward, pressing my palms against my forehead. Memories of Andrew as a boy spilled into my mind. The way his small hand had wrapped around mine the first time I took him fishing. The grin on his face when he rode his bike without training wheels, the sound of his voice calling me dad with pride. How could that same boy grow into a man who might send his father a death sentence wrapped in velvet? The thought made me sick, but I couldn't push it away. Andrew's reaction on the phone, the panic when I told him I'd given the watch to Richard, it hadn't been concern about losing an expensive gift. It had been fear. Fear that his plan had gone wrong. I sat for a long time in silence, the desert light shifting across the kitchen floor. The world I thought I knew had tilted. It wasn't just about a broken relationship anymore, or years of distance between father and son. Something deeper, more dangerous, had crept into our lives. I finally stood, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and washed the mug out with trembling hands. The sound of running water felt hollow in the quiet house. When I turned the faucet off, the silence pressed against me again, thicker than before. The Rolex was gone. Richard was fighting for his life, and I was left with the realization that my own blood might have wanted me dead. I gripped the counter, staring at the empty space where the watch had been, and whispered to myself, "This is only the beginning." If you're still watching and the tension is making your heart race a little, write number 3 in the comments to show you're still holding on. I didn't sleep much the night after Richard was taken to the hospital. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him pale and gasping, the Rolex glinting on his wrist like it was mocking me. I walked the length of my hallway until my knees ached, stopping only to pour cups of coffee I never finished. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to name what was wrong. I told myself again and again it could have been anything. Bad shellfish at dinner, a reaction to medication, or some fluke of his pacemaker. But the thought wouldn't leave me. The timing lined up too perfectly with the watch. By dawn, I knew I couldn't sit still. I reached for the phone, Andrew's number glowing back at me. For a moment, I almost put the receiver down, afraid of what I'd hear. But fathers don't get the luxury of fear when it comes to their children. I pressed the call button. He picked up on the second ring. "Dad," he said, smooth as ever, as if we'd spoken yesterday instead of after years of silence. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Andrew, I wanted to thank you for the gift. It was unexpected," he chuckled lightly. "It's just a watch, Dad. Thought you'd like it." "Richard wore it last night," I said carefully. "He's in the hospital this morning. Doctors aren't sure what happened." There was silence on the line, long enough to make my pulse quicken. Then he answered, cool and steady, "You think a watch put him there? You've always had a way of seeing ghosts where there aren't any." His words stung, but more than that, his tone carried a sharp edge I hadn't heard since he was a teenager testing boundaries. "I'm not accusing you," I managed. "I just want to understand why you sent it. You know I stopped wearing expensive things years ago." "Maybe I wanted to remind you of what class looks like," he said. Then his voice dropped half an octave, carrying something darker. "Maybe you're reading too much into everything, like you always do." Before I could respond, he ended the call. I stood there staring at the dead receiver, my hand trembling slightly. I had hoped for reassurance, even a denial. Instead, I was left with a heavier knot in my chest. Still desperate for some explanation, I drove into town, telling myself I'd look for answers. The jeweler's shop sat on the corner of Main Street, its windows filled with glittering displays that used to tempt me when Linda was alive. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and velvet. I asked casually about the Rolex, pretending I might want one for myself. The jeweler recognized it immediately. Yes, we had one like that. Special order. A young man, Andrew Dalton, if I recall, picked it up personally. He even requested a small engraving on the inside backplate, very discreet. I swallowed hard. An engraving? The jeweler nodded. Just initials. Nothing flashy. I thanked him and left, my head buzzing. Andrew hadn't mentioned engraving anything. He hadn't even written a card with the gift. Whatever message he had hidden inside that watch wasn't meant for celebration. It was meant for something else. Back home, I sat at my desk with a legal pad. I drew a line down the middle and labeled the columns, "What I know" and "What I can prove." Under the first, I wrote, "Andrew ordered the Rolex. Andrew engraved it. Richard collapsed soon after wearing it. Under the second, I had almost nothing, only the jeweler's word and my own suspicions. I stared at the imbalance until the letters blurred. For years I had believed a father's love could excuse mistakes, could bridge distance. But love doesn't erase proof, and it doesn't shield you from betrayal. My first attempt to resolve this as a misunderstanding had failed, and I felt the ground beneath me tilt towards something darker. That evening, I walked outside to breathe, hoping the cool air would clear my head. The sun had dropped behind the hills, painting the sky in long streaks of orange fading to gray. As I approached my front gate, I stopped cold. It was wide open. I always locked it, a habit Linda used to tease me about. I stood there, staring at the yawning gap, the quiet street stretching beyond. No footprints, no car parked nearby, just the heavy certainty that someone had been here, someone who wanted me to notice. I closed the gate and bolted it, but the unease lingered. Maybe it was paranoia, but paranoia had started with a watch, and now Richard was lying in a hospital bed. As the night pressed in around the house, I realized this wasn't over. My son had set something in motion, and I was no longer sure I could stop it with words. If you're still watching and this twist has left you unsettled, let me know by commenting number 4 right now. The pounding on my front door rattled the frame and dragged me out of the uneasy half-sleep I had fallen into. I shuffled across the living room, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and pulled open the door. Standing there was Margaret Lawson, Richard's wife. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes rimmed red, and she clutched her purse to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "That watch. You gave it to Richard. Didn't you?" Her voice cracked under the weight of fear and fury. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I could only nod. "The doctor said there's residue on it. Some kind of toxin. They don't know if it's what made him collapse, but they're not ruling it out. And you brought it into my home." Her words struck harder than her fist against my door ever could. I stammered out something about Andrew, about the gift being from him, not me, but Margaret wasn't listening. She turned on her heel and stormed off before I could stop her, leaving me with nothing but guilt gnawing at my gut. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the hospital. The drive was a blur of red lights and half-glimpsed storefronts. When I arrived, Richard lay hooked up to machines, his chest rising in shallow rhythm, wires sprouting from his arms like roots clinging to life. The steady beep of the monitor made my throat tighten. A doctor in a white coat met me in the hallway, his voice low. "Mr. Dalton, the Rolex contained traces of a toxic compound. We're running further tests, but it appears exposure over time could have caused significant harm. It's not something that happens by accident." The words spun in my head. Not an accident. Deliberate. I left the hospital and dialed Andrew again, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. To my surprise, he answered this time. "Dad," he said coolly, "I was wondering when you'd call." "Richard's in the hospital," I said, my voice hoarse. "Doctors think it's from the watch you sent me. You want to explain that?" There was a pause, then a short, dismissive laugh. "He shouldn't have worn it so soon. Guess he's more fragile than I thought." My blood ran cold. He had just admitted more than he realized. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and pressed the small recorder I had taken from my desk earlier. A soft red light blinked inside the fabric. "You knew it would hurt him," I said. "Don't twist my words, Dad. You've always been good at that. Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me instead of other people, we wouldn't be here." His voice sharpened with bitterness. "You've been siding with Richard's family for years. Maybe now you'll see what loyalty costs." That was enough. I ended the call before I said something I couldn't take back. That evening, I drove to Andrew's house. His neighborhood looked as polished as the Rolex itself. Perfect lawns, spotless cars, houses that all resembled each other in bland uniformity. Andrew opened the door, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dad," he said flatly, "couldn't stay away?" I brushed past him into the living room. "Why'd you do it, Andrew?" I asked, my voice shaking. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Why did I what? Send you a gift? Show a little generosity for once?" "Don't play games. Richard almost died because of that watch." He laughed, low and humorless. "Maybe you should have kept it then. Wasn't that the point? For you?" My eyes fell on the desk in the corner. Half hidden beneath a stack of bills was a small notebook. The corner of a page stuck out, with hand-drawn sketches of Rolex cases. I stepped closer, and though Andrew didn't stop me, I saw enough. Notations, arrows pointing to compartments, initials scribbled on the side. RDHD. My heart clenched. Robert dashed me. He had mapped us both into his twisted plans. "You planned this," I said quietly. Andrew's jaw tightened. "You should have thought twice before giving away what was mine to destroy. You always choose them over me. Well, maybe now you'll regret it." The words cut deeper than any blade could. Before I could reply, Andrew straightened, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "And don't think you can just run to the police. You have no idea what else I've prepared. That watch was only one piece. You can't stop me." The air in the room felt poisonous. I turned and walked out, my legs stiff, my chest burning. In my pocket, the recorder was still running, capturing every word. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were steady, but my soul wasn't. I understood now, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a cruel mistake. It was war, and my own son had declared it. I sat in my truck long after leaving Andrew's house, the night pressing down on the windshield like a heavy quilt. The little recorder lay on the seat beside me, its red light blinking every few seconds, each flash a reminder of the conversation I had just endured. Andrew's words replayed in my mind like a curse. "You don't know half of what I've prepared." His voice hadn't wavered, not once. He had sounded calm, almost smug, as though he had already won. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles burned white. For a moment, I wasn't 68, worn down by years and a bum heart. I was younger again, remembering the boy who used to sit in the passenger seat where that recorder now lay. Andrew at 10, grinning after we'd gone fishing. Andrew at 15, sulking, but still asking me to check the oil in his beat-up Chevy. Andrew at 20, pacing nervously before proposing to Emily. Those memories stung now, sharp as glass. The boy in my mind and the man in front of me were strangers, and I couldn't reconcile them. I told myself to breathe, but every inhale felt like a betrayal. Was I betraying my son by recording him, by considering turning him in? Or was I betraying myself and Richard if I stayed silent? Loyalty to blood runs deep, but loyalty to truth, to justice, runs deeper still. I'd served in the army long enough to know what happens when you let rot go unchecked. It spreads. It devours. The hospital lights hit me before I realized where I was driving. Margaret met me in the corridor, her face set in stone. "You should have stopped him years ago, Frank," she hissed. "If you don't stop him now, he'll finish what he started." Her words were sharp, unforgiving. I wanted to tell her I hadn't known, that no father imagines his son capable of such darkness. But the truth caught in my throat. Deep down, I had seen shadows in Andrew before. I had just chosen not to follow them. Inside Richard's room, Linda sat beside her husband's bed, her hand clutching his. The steady beep of the monitor filled the silence. She looked at me, her eyes softer than Margaret's, but no less firm. "Frank, silence won't protect anyone. Not you, not Richard, not even Andrew." Her voice cracked, but her conviction didn't. I stared at Richard. His chest rose and fell with the help of machines, each breath a battle. This wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't even just about my son. It was about right and wrong, life and death. That night at my kitchen table, I laid everything out in front of me. The Rolex watch, the hidden notebook I had slipped from Andrew's desk, and the recorder. The evidence sat there like strangers at a wake, mute but damning. I grabbed a large manila envelope, slid them inside, and wrote across the front in block letters, "Frank Harper, October 14, evidence." My handwriting trembled, but it was steady enough to be read. As I sealed the envelope, my chest tightened. I thought about Andrew as a child, how he used to slip notes under my door saying, "Good night, Dad," with little stick figure drawings. Now here I was, sealing away his future with another kind of note. A father shouldn't have to make this choice, but fathers don't always get to choose the easy road. I whispered to the empty house, "Better to lose you to prison than bury you in the ground, or worse, bury someone else because of you." My words echoed back off the walls, and for once, they didn't feel hollow. I picked up the envelope and walked to the fireproof box in the closet. The same box that held Linda's will, the deed to the house, and decades of insurance papers. I set the envelope inside gently, like laying down a fragile piece of glass. The lid closed with a soft click that felt louder than thunder. My decision was final. When I turned off the light and sat back down at the table, I felt both heavier and lighter. Heavier because I knew I had severed the last thread binding me to Andrew as a father who still hoped for redemption. Lighter because, for the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I had to do. Tomorrow, I would hand that envelope to Detective Morales. Tomorrow, the law would carry the weight I could no longer bear alone. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling until my eyes blurred. The boy I raised was gone. The man who remained had made his choice, and now I had made mine. If you're still watching and the choices being made feel impossible to you, comment number 5, so I know you're right here walking through it with me. The morning after I made my decision, the house felt altered, as if the walls themselves were aware of what was coming. I woke before dawn, the ache in my chest heavier than usual, and stood at the kitchen window, watching the gray sky push against the horizon. I brewed a pot of coffee out of habit, poured a mug, and left it untouched on the table. My hands kept circling the cup, warming themselves, but I didn't drink. It wasn't coffee I needed. It was resolve, ... The phone rang just after 7. Margaret's name flashed on the screen. Her voice was clipped, sharp with urgency. "Frank, you're going through with this, aren't you?" she demanded. I hesitated a beat too long. She caught it. "If you back down now, if you let him walk away from what he's done, then you're no better than him." Her words sliced through the thin skin of my doubt. I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't know what it meant to hand your own blood to the wolves, but she did know betrayal. She had lived it too. I muttered, "I'm not backing down." She didn't thank me, she just hung up, leaving the silence to bruise me further. Later that morning, I drove to the hospital. The hall smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Richard lay in his bed, pale but awake, his voice thin. "Frank," he whispered, "don't let this kill more than my body. Don't let it destroy everything else." Linda clutched his hand, her face calm, but her eyes heavy with quiet fury. I apologized again, though no words could erase the truth that my choice to pass along the Rolex had nearly ended his life. Richard shook his head slightly. "It wasn't you, it was him. Don't carry his sin." But I carried it anyway, every time I looked at the lines carved deeper into his face. That afternoon, Emily came to my door. Her hair was pulled back, but strands had fallen loose, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep. She didn't sit, just stood trembling in the entryway. "Andrew confronted me last night," she admitted, voice cracking. "He said I was betraying him, that I'd regret siding with you. Frank, he's not the man I married. I don't know who he is anymore." She pressed her arms against her chest like she was holding herself together. I tried to comfort her, but she waved me off. "Please, don't let him drag us all down. Do what you have to do." Her words echoed long after she left, turning the knife deeper. As night fell, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I drew 2 columns, what I know and what I can prove. Each word I wrote felt like another stone on a scale already tipping against my son. The paper trail grew, not of love letters or family memories, but of betrayal, threats, and a poisoned gift. This, I thought bitterly, might be my legacy. Not photographs of fishing trips or graduations, but a box full of evidence that my son had tried to end me. When I stepped out to take the trash, something caught my eye. Footprints in the damp earth near the back door. They weren't mine. A few cigarette butts were scattered by the porch, fresh enough to glisten under the moonlight. My stomach twisted. Andrew had been here, watching, waiting. He wanted me to know I was being shadowed. It was intimidation, subtle but effective, a warning that he hadn't lost his grip entirely. I locked the back door and checked the deadbolts twice, my breath shallow. Back inside, I laid the evidence box on the table. Its weight seemed heavier than before. The Rolex sat inside, gleaming even in the dim light, mocking me with its cold perfection. I whispered into the quiet house, "This ends with me." The words sounded both like a promise and a eulogy. The night pressed against the windows as I sat there, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Every creak of the wood, every hum of the refrigerator became a reminder that the line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. The decision was made, and the consequences were already in motion. The Harper family, whatever remained of it, would never be whole again. The morning crept in gray and heavy, and I felt as though I hadn't slept at all. My eyes burned, and my chest carried the dull weight of too many nights without rest. The house didn't comfort me anymore. It caged me. Every creak of the wood, every whistle of wind against the siding, reminded me that someone had been inside before. My own home no longer felt mine. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the fireproof box. Inside lay everything I had gathered: the Rolex Andrew sent, the typed threats, the photographs, and index cards covered with my shaky handwriting. Each scrap of evidence was also a scar. I realized I couldn't keep living in this half state of fear and waiting. Something had to shift. That thought carried me out the door. I drove toward the police station, the morning traffic a blur. My hand rested on the wheel, and I thought back to when Andrew was just a boy. He used to sit beside me in that same passenger seat, swinging his legs because they didn't reach the floor. He'd ask about everything: why the sky changed color, why the old mill had stopped turning, why I never left the farm for long. Those questions seemed harmless then. Now, the silence he carried felt heavier than all the questions he never asked. Detective Harris met me with the same calm steadiness as before. His office smelled faintly of coffee and copier ink. I slid the Rolex across the table, along with a folder of notes and the photographs I'd taken of the scuff marks by my back door. "Every piece counts," Harris said, examining them carefully. He took photographs, bagged items, and assured me this strengthened the case. He also reminded me that intimidation was common. Andrew's attempts to rattle me were proof he felt cornered. It didn't comfort me much, but it meant we weren't chasing shadows anymore. I didn't expect Margaret to arrive, but she did, her coat still dusted with frost. She carried a folder of her own, filled with medical notes and statements from Robert about the night he'd collapsed. "We can't wait," she said firmly. "We need to make sure Dad's testimony is written and signed. If his heart fails again, the truth can't go with him." I saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire Linda carried when she insisted on keeping the family steady through storms. Her strength only sharpened my guilt for pulling her into this. Later that afternoon, I sat in the hospital cafeteria, the smell of reheated soup and burnt coffee hanging in the air. Emily, my daughter-in-law, asked to meet me there. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her tea. Her voice was low, almost cracked when she finally spoke. "Andrew forged my name on loan documents," she whispered. "I thought it was just a mistake at first. But then I saw more: mortgages, accounts I never opened. He's drowning us in debt." She pulled a USB drive from her coat pocket and set it on the table. "I copied these from his laptop before he locked me out. I can't keep this secret anymore." Her face was pale with fear, but her eyes carried a glimmer of relief. I turned the drive over in my hand, feeling its weight. It wasn't just about poisoning anymore. Andrew wasn't simply lashing out at me. He had built a structure of lies and fraud, and I was one more obstacle to be cleared. For the first time, I understood that his betrayal wasn't impulsive. It was systematic. He hadn't only wanted revenge, he wanted control. That evening, I visited Richard and Linda. Richard sat in his worn armchair, a blanket over his legs, while Linda knit quietly beside him. I told them about Emily's confession, about the USB drive, about the way Andrew's scheme ran deeper than any of us guessed. Richard's jaw tightened. "Survival means choosing truth over comfort," he said, "even if it destroys the family you thought you had." Linda nodded slowly, the knitting needles clicking in her lap. "You don't get to pick the storm," she murmured. "You only choose whether to stand in it or hide." I drove home with their words echoing in my head. In the quiet of my kitchen, I slid the USB into my old laptop. Rows of spreadsheets glowed across the screen, filled with numbers, account transfers, even coded notes that made my stomach twist. The evidence was all there, undeniable and cold. I closed the laptop, pulled a fresh index card, and wrote, USB drive, financial records, fraud. I slipped it into the fireproof box with the rest. Then I whispered to myself, there's no turning back. Before heading to bed, I checked the thread stretched across the doorframe, still unbroken, still telling me the truth, and for the first time that day, I let out a long, steady breath. If you're still watching and these consequences feel heavier than you imagined, type number 6 to let me know you're still standing strong with the story. The morning of the hearing felt heavier than any storm cloud I had ever stood beneath. I sat on the edge of my bed, the old alarm clock ticking too loud, and tried to gather my thoughts. Margaret made me coffee, though neither of us touched it. We both knew this day wasn't about comfort. It was about truth. It was about seeing how far my son had fallen and whether the law would carry the weight I had been holding on my shoulders. When we arrived at the courthouse, the building loomed like a monument to every mistake and every attempt at justice that had ever passed through its doors. My steps echoed across the marble floor, and my chest tightened with each one. The prosecutor nodded at me from across the hallway, a silent reassurance that the evidence was strong, that we had done everything right. Still, my hands trembled. Detective Harris found me just before the session began. His face, usually stern but not unkind, looked carved from stone. "It's official," he said quietly. "Your son is being charged with attempted murder, financial fraud, and forgery. The evidence is overwhelming. The Rolex wasn't just a gift, it was a weapon. The USB sealed the rest." His words landed like iron on my chest, heavy and cold. Inside the courtroom, Andrew sat at the defense table, in a gray suit that didn't quite fit him. His hair was too neatly combed, as if tidiness could erase what he had done. He didn't look at me at first, his eyes fixed on the floor. When the judge entered, everyone rose, and for a moment, I remembered the little boy who once stood beside me at church, tugging at my sleeve because he couldn't see over the pews. That memory cracked like glass when I saw the hard set of his jaw. The charges were read aloud: attempted murder by poisoning, fraud through forged financial documents, and conspiracy to conceal assets. Each word felt like another nail in a coffin I never wanted built. The prosecutor laid out the evidence in sharp, steady tones. The Rolex laced with toxins, Richard's near-fatal collapse, the detailed notes in Andrew's handwriting, and the digital files Emily had surrendered. There was no way to soften it. My son had not just made mistakes. He had plotted, calculated, and acted with malice. When Emily took the stand, her voice shook, but her words carried weight. "He lied to me," she said, looking down at her folded hands. "He lied to all of us." I didn't want to believe he could hurt anyone, but then I saw the files. I saw what he planned to do, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. Her eyes flicked to me for the briefest moment, filled with sorrow, but also courage. Margaret sat beside me, her hand resting on mine. She hadn't said much all morning, but her presence was like a pillar keeping me upright. Across the aisle, Andrew finally lifted his eyes. When they met mine, the years fell away for just an instant. I searched for the son I had raised, the boy who once carved his initials into the old oak tree in our backyard. Instead, I found someone hardened by greed and resentment, someone who had chosen betrayal over family. His lips moved, barely a whisper. "This isn't the end." The judge's gavel came down, sharp and final. Andrew would be held without bail until trial. The prosecutor had argued successfully that he posed too great a danger to be released. The defense muttered about family misunderstandings and a father's bitterness, but their words sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence. As we filed out of the courtroom, the air felt different, cooler, sharper, like autumn had finally claimed its place. Reporters lingered outside, but none called my name. This wasn't a story for the front page of the nation. It was a quiet tragedy in a small town, a father standing against his son. I paused on the courthouse steps, the stones still warm under my feet despite the chill in the air. Relief and grief washed over me together. Relief that justice was finally set in motion. Grief that my own blood had become the enemy I never thought I'd face. Margaret slipped her arm through mine, steadying me. "It's almost over," she said softly. But I knew better. Justice might come with the verdict, but peace would not arrive so easily. I looked across the street where the leaves had started to turn, their fiery colors dancing in the wind. I thought about Richard recovering at home, about Emily trying to piece her life back together, and about the long shadow Andrew had cast over us all. The outcome had been decided in that courtroom, but the real outcome was carved inside me. Family ties had been cut, not by distance or misunderstanding, but by betrayal. The gavel had fallen, but my heart still carried the echo. As I walked down the steps, I whispered to myself, "This isn't victory. This is survival." And with that, I stepped into the autumn air, eddy for whatever. The courthouse had emptied hours ago, but the echo of that final gavel still clung to me like the aftertaste of bitter medicine. I sat in my old leather chair, the one Margaret had insisted I keep, despite its cracked arms and fading color. It felt like the only place in the world where my body could sink and my thoughts could scatter safely. Andrew was no longer my concern, at least not in the legal sense. The state had him now, boxed away in a system that would measure his days in years. But the truth was heavier than the sentence. The truth was that my son had tried to erase me, and no verdict would ever rewrite that. The quiet of the house pressed in around me. Margaret moved softly in the kitchen, her presence steady as the ticking of the wall clock. She had endured every hearing, every whispered conversation, and every sleepless night with a strength I once mistook for silence. Now I understood it was her way of holding the ground beneath us firm, even when it felt like the earth might crack. When she stepped into the living room with a cup of tea, her eyes met mine. No words passed between us, but none were needed. Her glance carried everything: sorrow, endurance, and a reminder that love can survive storms that break lesser things. Richard called earlier, his voice weak but warmer than it had been in months. He told me he'd taken a short walk outside, just to feel the air on his skin. "Every breath feels borrowed," he admitted. I told him that borrowed breaths were still life, and that was more than enough. Emily had written a letter, one she didn't trust herself to read aloud. In it, she described how she was learning to reclaim her days, how she'd scrubbed the garage until the smell of chemicals no longer reminded her of Andrew's experiments. She closed the letter by thanking me, not because I had chosen the law over blood, but because I had chosen truth over fear. Her words sank deeper than I expected. I thought back to the first cracks in Andrew's character, the moments I had brushed aside as youthful arrogance or stubborn ambition. I remembered lending him money and excusing the half-hearted thank yous, dismissing the way his eyes sharpened when I refused a request. Trust, I realized, is like glass. It shines, it holds weight, but once shattered, no glue in the world can return it to what it was. My mistake was believing I could love him enough to keep the cracks from spreading. What I learned was this: sometimes love means letting someone face the weight of their own choices. Protecting him from consequences would have been the cruelest lie. I walked to the porch, the air carrying the scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. The swing creaked under me, its new chains glinting in the fading sun. It had been rebuilt since the chaos began, the boards sanded smooth, the rusted screws replaced. I ran my hand along the armrest, thinking about how this swing had once been a place of comfort, then a place of suspicion, and now, finally, a place of quiet again. Life has a way of reusing spaces, even the broken ones. I thought of the Rolex, the shining watch that had started this cascade, a gift that was no gift at all. I no longer saw it as a symbol of wealth or betrayal, but as a reminder that appearances can be poisoned. That watch had never told the time. It had only marked the moment when the son I raised chose to turn his back on me. And yet, I no longer needed to hate it. Objects don't betray people. People betray people. Justice, I've learned, is not the same as peace. The courtroom gave me safety. It drew a line that Andrew could not cross again, at least not for many years. But healing is something different. It comes in the form of breathing without checking the locks twice, of eating dinner without flinching at the sound of the phone, of sitting beside Margaret and feeling the warmth of her hand, without the cold shadow of suspicion between us. Revenge gave me a verdict. Forgiveness, not for Andrew, but for myself, would have to give me the rest. So, I decided, right there on that swing, as the last light stretched thin across the yard, that I would not spend the rest of my life defined by what my son had tried to take from me. I would live in the house I'd built, with the woman who still stood beside me, among the friends who had carried me when my own blood had tried to bury me. Betrayal changes a man, but it does not have to end him. And while my son may believe this story is unfinished, I know better. His chapter may continue in a prison cell, but mine continues here, in the open air, one breath at a time. Revenge gave me justice, but peace that I will build myself quietly, steadily, one morning sunrise at a time. There are moments in life when we believe that strength comes from holding on, from clinging to the people we love no matter how deeply they wound us. But sometimes true strength lies in letting go, of illusions, of false loyalties, of the idea that love can excuse betrayal. Life has a way of teaching us that trust is not a given. It is earned slowly, and when broken, it can shape the way we see the world forever. In those moments of fracture, the decision is not just about who has wronged us, but about who we will become when faced with the truth. Revenge for many carries the flavor of bitterness, a desire to strike back at those who caused us pain. Yet, when the dust settles, revenge often reveals itself to be something different. It is not about hurting in return, but about reclaiming what was taken: dignity, safety, and the right to live without fear. Justice, when pursued not out of spite but out of necessity, becomes a form of protection. It tells the world, and ourselves, that some lines must never be crossed, no matter who stands on the other side. And so, the story of betrayal becomes, paradoxically, a story of resilience. It is not about the poison of anger, but the clarity that comes when we choose truth over denial. In standing firm, we learn that survival is not merely the absence of death, but the presence of courage in the face of deception. The wounds of betrayal may never vanish, but they can transform. They remind us to honor the quiet companions of life: loyalty, honesty, and the rare souls who show up when the storm breaks. There is also a lesson in silence, in the spaces left by broken bonds. Silence can be heavy, reminding us of what was lost, but it can also be a canvas for renewal. In that silence, we find room to rebuild, to rediscover the small rituals of living: morning light across a kitchen table, the comfort of routine, the solace of steady hands. It is in these ordinary moments that healing begins, not with grand gestures, but with the simple choice to keep moving forward. Perhaps the greatest wisdom is this: we are not defined solely by the harm done to us, but by the way we choose to rise from it. Betrayal can break the heart, but it cannot extinguish the human spirit unless we allow it. Justice may deliver closure, but peace is something we must build ourselves, brick by brick, breath by breath, choosing not to live in fear, but in quiet defiance of it. In the end, the story does not belong to the one who betrayed, but to the one who endured. It belongs to the steady resolve to face each day with honesty, to stand guard over what is sacred, and to walk forward even when shadows linger. For life, at its core, is not about the storms we survive, but about the strength we find in their aftermath. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.